There is a version of World War II that most people carry somewhere in the back of their minds. It has clear sides. It has a beginning that explains why it started, and an ending that explains why it had to end. The good and the bad are distributed cleanly across uniforms and borders. The atrocities are located in specific places, assigned to specific people, condemned in specific trials, and then filed away. That version of the war is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. It is incomplete in ways that were sometimes deliberate. What tends to get left out is not the violence. The violence was documented extensively. What tends to get left out is the texture of how that violence was produced. The memos, the committees, the requisition forms, the bureaucratic language that turned human beings into logistical variables. The way that ordinary administrative processes were used to authorize, organize, and sustain actions that would have been considered crimes in any other context. The way that repetition flattened the shock until there was no shock left. The way that systems, once built to a certain scale, began to generate their own momentum regardless of the intentions of the individuals operating inside them. The 18 reports in this narration were real in the sense that the events they describe were real. Some were suppressed by governments, some were buried in archives, some were acknowledged briefly and then allowed to disappear from the public record. Some were never released in full during the lifetimes of the people involved. Some were classified not because of military necessity but because of institutional embarrassment. What connects them is not their subject matter. What connects them is what they reveal about how the war actually functioned at the level of process, decision, and routine. The first thing to understand is that the war did not feel exceptional to most of the people running it. That is not a moral judgment. It is an operational observation. The officers who managed supply chains, the clerks who processed prisoner transfers, the officials who drafted the legal frameworks governing occupied territories, the scientists who conducted experiments under military authorization, the administrators who oversaw labor allocations in occupied countries, the intelligence officers who decided what information to pass up the chain of command and what to quietly let disappear. These people went to work each morning, sat at desks, ate lunch, signed papers and went home. The scale of what they were participating in was not something most of them encountered directly in the course of a single workday. It was distributed across thousands of individual tasks, each of which, taken alone, looked like ordinary administrative work. That is where the real history lives, not in the exceptional moments, in the ordinary ones. The Allied bombing campaigns over Germany and occupied Europe produced more documented civilian casualties than any other single category of action in the Western theater. The numbers were known at the time. They were tracked, reported, and filed. The February 1945 bombing of Dresden killed somewhere between 22,000 and 25,000 people, according to the most reliable post-war estimates, though earlier estimates ran much higher and were circulated widely in the immediate aftermath. The targeting philosophy that governed operations like Dresden was not a secret within the command structure. It was debated openly among senior officers. The strategic aim was not solely the destruction of military infrastructure. It included what planners called the disruption of civilian morale and the degradation of the enemy's will to continue. These were formal categories in targeting doctrine. They were written into planning documents. The fact that this meant the deliberate destruction of residential areas populated by non-combatants was not incidental to the planning. It was a stated component of the operational logic. The reports generated after the Dresden raid were not suppressed immediately. They were distributed through normal channels. The casualty figures were noted. The physical damage was photographed and catalogued. What happened over time was something more gradual than suppression. The event was absorbed into a category called strategic necessity and then allowed to recede. Senior RAF Commander Arthur Harris, who had overseen the broader area bombing campaign and who never disguised his view that the deliberate targeting of German cities was sound strategy, did not receive a campaign medal after the war. He was the only senior Allied commander to be treated that way. The official explanation was administrative. No medal had been created for the Bomber Command campaign specifically. Harris spent years afterward attempting to have this corrected. He was not prosecuted. He was not formally censured. He was simply not celebrated in the same way as other commanders, and the records of the internal debates about his methods were not made widely available for several decades. The gap between what was known and what was said is not the same as a conspiracy. It operated differently. It operated as a kind of institutional preference for certain framings over others. The framings that were preferred were the ones that maintained the coherence of the war's moral architecture. The framings that were suppressed or de-emphasized were the ones that complicated that architecture. This happened not through a single directive, but through thousands of individual decisions by people who understood, without being told explicitly, which kind of report was useful and which kind was not. The deliberate starvation of German prisoners of war in the immediate post-war period is among the most thoroughly documented and least discussed episodes in American military history. In the spring and summer of 1945, millions of German prisoners were held in open field enclosures along the Rhine River. These facilities, which were not technically defined as prisoner of war camps under the Geneva Convention because the prisoners had been reclassified as disarmed enemy forces, a category that did not exist in international law prior to that moment, lacked adequate food, water, shelter, and medical care, and the death toll estimates range from several thousand to several 100,000, depending on the methodology of the historian and the willingness of the relevant archives to release complete records. The reclassification was not accidental. It was a deliberate administrative decision made at the level of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. By reclassifying prisoners as disarmed enemy forces rather than prisoners of war, the Allied command removed the legal obligation to treat them according to the Geneva Convention standards that American and British forces had consistently invoked during the war when their own soldiers were captured. The paperwork that affected this reclassification was signed. It was filed. It was distributed to subordinate commands. The consequences were predictable to anyone familiar with the logistics of maintaining large numbers of people in outdoor enclosures in the early spring without adequate supply infrastructure. The consequences were, in this sense, anticipated. The reports from field commanders about conditions in these enclosures were filed. Some of them described conditions that were difficult to reconcile with the stated values of the forces creating them. Some of those reports were acted upon. Conditions improved in some locations as the logistical situation stabilized. Some reports were not acted upon. The International Committee of the Red Cross requested access to the enclosures and was denied on the grounds that the reclassification meant the Geneva Convention did not apply, and therefore the ICRC's mandate did not extend to these individuals. That denial was also documented. The documentation exists in archives. The German civilian population in areas under Soviet occupation experienced systematic violence that was documented by Allied intelligence services, by neutral observers, and by the German government in exile's diplomatic communications. The rape of German women by Soviet troops in the final months of the war and in the occupation period that followed occurred on a scale that contemporaneous Soviet military reports acknowledged, even as those same reports were suppressed or heavily redacted before distribution outside the immediate command structure. Estimates of the number of German and German-occupied territory women subjected to sexual violence by Soviet troops during this period range from hundreds of thousands to 2 million. The variation in the estimates reflects not uncertainty about whether it happened at the scale historians now broadly accept, but uncertainty about the precise figures given the incomplete survival of relevant records. American and British intelligence services received reports about this violence throughout 1945 and into 1946. The decision about how to handle these reports was not primarily a moral calculation. It was a strategic one. The Soviet Union was an ally. The alliance was already showing signs of the strain that would define the post-war period. The reports were received, assessed, and largely withheld from public release. Some were classified. Others were acknowledged in internal communications but not forwarded to press offices or made available to journalists. The logic was straightforward. Publishing detailed accounts of Soviet atrocities against German civilians in 1945 would complicate the political management of the occupation zones and the early negotiations over the shape of post-war Europe. It would also raise uncomfortable questions about the moral equivalence of wartime conduct that the overall victory narrative was not structured to accommodate. The reports were not destroyed. They were filed. Some of them were declassified decades later. The information they contained, once public, was absorbed into the historical record without producing any significant change in how the war was officially remembered or taught. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army that operated in Manchuria from 1937 until the end of the war. The unit conducted lethal experiments on prisoners, the majority of whom were Chinese, though Korean, Russian, Mongolian and some Allied POW subjects were also documented. The experiments included vivisection, pathogen injection, frostbite testing, pressure chamber testing, deliberate infection with plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax and other diseases, weapon testing on living subjects, and experiments related to blood transfusion and the limits of human survival under extreme conditions. The number of people who died as a result of the unit's activities is estimated at between 3,000 and 12,000 directly. With the broader biological warfare program, the unit supported contributing to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians through deliberate pathogen releases. The unit was commanded by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. At the end of the war, as Soviet forces advanced into Manchuria, Ishii ordered the destruction of the facilities and the killing of surviving test subjects. Unit personnel were dispersed. The physical evidence of what had occurred was substantially destroyed. Ishii himself was captured briefly by American forces and then released. The decision to grant immunity from prosecution to Ishii and the senior personnel of Unit 731 was made by the American military government in Japan under General Douglas MacArthur. The logic was documented in internal communications. The research data generated by the unit's experiments was considered to have significant military value. Specifically, the data on biological weapons effectiveness and on human physiological responses to various pathogens and extreme conditions was considered data that American military medical researchers could not ethically replicate themselves. The immunity agreement exchanged that data for protection from prosecution. The agreement was made without the knowledge or consent of the other Allied powers, including the Soviet Union, which had its own interest in prosecuting Unit 731 personnel. The Nuremberg trials, which were running concurrently with the American negotiations with Unit 731 personnel, established as a foundational principle of post-war international law that the commission of crimes against humanity could not be excused by superior orders or by the argument that the crimes produced valuable information. The immunity agreement with Unit 731 was reached by the same government that was simultaneously prosecuting German officials at Nuremberg for crimes that included medical experimentation on prisoners. The parallel was not discussed publicly. The records of the immunity agreement were classified. They were not declassified in substantial form until the 1990s. Ishii died in Tokyo in 1959 of throat cancer. He was never charged with a war crime. The Allied strategic bombing of France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and other occupied Western European countries killed an estimated 60,000 French civilians alone between 1940 and 1945. The bombing of transportation infrastructure, rail yards, bridges, and industrial facilities in occupied countries was a core component of Allied strategy, particularly in the period leading up to and following the Normandy invasion. The civilian casualties produced by these operations were known. They were tracked. French civilian authorities submitted formal protests to Allied command through diplomatic channels. The protests were received, acknowledged, and filed. The bombing continued. The internal debates about the acceptable level of civilian casualties in the occupied countries were conducted at the highest levels of Allied command and involved, at various points, Churchill, Eisenhower, and the combined chiefs of staff. Churchill expressed concern at several points about the political consequences of killing large numbers of French civilians, not on moral grounds primarily, but on the grounds that it would complicate the post-war relationship with France and potentially affect the stability of de Gaulle's provisional government. The targeting protocols were adjusted in some cases as a result of these concerns. They were not adjusted sufficiently to prevent approximately 60,000 deaths. The exact figure remains uncertain because the records from different Allied commands used different methodologies for tracking casualties and different definitions of what counted as a direct consequence of bombing operations. The liberation of France was celebrated. The civilian casualties produced in the course of that liberation were not made the subject of formal proceedings or official acknowledgement. The French government, which had its own complicated set of reasons for managing the memory of the occupation and liberation period carefully, did not press the issue in ways that would have been diplomatically disruptive. The medical experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners by German doctors under SS authorization are among the most documented atrocities of the war. They are also among the most selectively engaged with in terms of what happened to the knowledge they produced. The hypothermia experiments conducted at Dachau by Sigmund Rascher involved immersing prisoners in ice water and documenting the rate and nature of physiological deterioration. The data from these experiments, which killed an unknown number of subjects and were conducted without any pretense of consent, was submitted in detailed reports to the Luftwaffe, which had commissioned them to address the problem of pilot survival in the North Sea. After the war, the question of whether to use this data in legitimate medical research became the subject of internal debate in American and British medical and military circles. The data existed. It was detailed. It addressed questions, specifically the physiological process of hypothermia and the most effective rewarming techniques that were medically and militarily relevant. Using it would mean deriving benefit from crimes against humanity. Not using it would mean destroying data that might save lives. The debate was conducted in internal memos and medical journals in the years immediately following the war. Some researchers used the data, citing its medical value. Others refused, citing the conditions under which it was obtained. The debate was never formally resolved through any official process. Individual researchers made individual decisions. Some of the data was incorporated into subsequent research without explicit citation of its origin. Some was not used. The Rascher data specifically has been the subject of ongoing medical ethics discussion for decades, with no consensus reached on whether using it is ethically permissible, ethically required, or ethically prohibited. The men who conducted the experiments were tried at Nuremberg in the doctor's trial. Several were executed. The question of what to do with their findings was not adjudicated at Nuremberg. It was left to subsequent institutions to manage without guidance. The treatment of Japanese Americans during the war is documented extensively, but the internal government reports that informed and preceded the internment decision reveal something about the relationship between official findings and official policy that the subsequent legal vindication of internment survivors does not fully address. The Munson Report, commissioned by the State Department in 1941, concluded that Japanese Americans on the West Coast did not represent a significant security risk, and that mass internment was not justified by the available intelligence. The report was completed before the internment order was signed. It was received by officials who proceeded to sign the internment order anyway. The report was not made available to the courts that reviewed constitutional challenges to the internment. It was classified. It was not declassified until decades later. The decision to intern approximately 120,000 people of Japanese descent, the majority of them American citizens, was made not because the available intelligence supported it, but in spite of the available intelligence contradicting it. The legal framework that permitted the internment was the one the courts ultimately reviewed. The intelligence framework that had been built to assess the actual risk was withheld from those courts. The Supreme Court, in Korematsu v. United States, upheld the constitutionality of the exclusion orders in 1944, a decision that was formally overturned in a different case in 2018, 74 years later. The reports were not lost. They were filed. They were retrievable. They simply were not produced in the proceedings where they would have been most consequential. The British use of chemical weapons in Iraq after the First World War is sometimes cited as context for British policy debates during the Second World War, but what is less commonly discussed is the internal debate within the British government in 1944 and 1945 about whether to authorize the use of chemical weapons against Germany. Churchill, in a memorandum dated July 1944, requested that the Chiefs of Staff examine the possibility of using poison gas and anthrax against German cities, framing it as a serious question to be addressed without sentiment. He specifically mentioned anthrax as potentially capable of depopulating an area entirely, and asked whether it would be possible to drench the cities of Germany in such a way as to make them uninhabitable for a generation. The memorandum was received by the Chiefs of Staff, and a response was prepared. The response was cautious on practical and strategic grounds, noting concerns about retaliation and the logistical challenges of a large-scale chemical or biological weapons deployment. Churchill accepted the assessment, and the discussion moved on. The memorandum existed, it was filed. It was classified for decades. When it was eventually released and reported on by historians, the coverage was limited. It did not substantially alter the public understanding of Churchill's role in the war or his place in the historical memory of the conflict. The distance between what a leader contemplated and what he ultimately authorized was treated as sufficient to maintain the existing framing. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945, specifically the Operation Meeting House raids conducted on the night of March 9th and into the morning of March 10th, killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night. The casualty figure exceeded the immediate death toll from either atomic bomb dropped later that year. The operation was commanded by General Curtis LeMay, who had deliberately shifted from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude incendiary bombing, specifically because the incendiary approach produced greater destruction of the densely built wooden residential areas of Japanese cities. The shift in strategy was not accidental. It was a deliberate operational choice made on the basis of assessments of what approach would produce the most damage to Japanese civilian infrastructure, and by extension, Japanese morale and war-making capacity. LeMay later said with characteristic directness that if the United States had lost the war, he would have been tried as a war criminal. He said this not as an expression of guilt, but as an observation about the relationship between outcome and judgment. He was not tried. He received the Distinguished Service Medal and eventually rose to become Chief of Staff of the Air Force. The reports filed after the Tokyo raids documented the damage with the same procedural thoroughness applied to any other operation. Target coverage assessments, bomb damage analysis, estimates of industrial capacity destroyed. The category of civilian deaths appeared in the same documentation, but in a different column. The operational language did not distinguish morally between the destruction of a factory and the destruction of a neighborhood. Both were assessed in terms of their contribution to the degradation of enemy capacity. The use of the atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki has been analyzed more extensively than almost any other decision in 20th century history. What tends to receive less attention than the decision itself is the process by which the target cities were selected. The Target Committee, which met in April and May of 1945 to determine which Japanese cities would be bombed with atomic weapons, was a formal body that operated with the procedural thoroughness of any military planning committee. The minutes of its meetings were kept. The criteria it used were documented. The committee considered and rejected certain cities for specific reasons. Kyoto was removed from the target list by Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who had visited the city before the war and considered its cultural significance a reason to spare it. The replacement city was Nagasaki. The committee's criteria for target selection included a preference for cities that had not already been heavily damaged by conventional bombing, on the grounds that the effects of the atomic weapon needed to be clearly measurable and not confounded by prior destruction. The committee also noted the value of selecting targets that were surrounded by terrain that would maximize the blast and thermal effects. The language in which these deliberations were conducted was precise and technical. It treated the selection of which city's population would absorb the first use of a new category of weapon as a problem in operational research. The reports generated after the bombings were extensive. The strategic bombing survey teams that entered Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the weeks and months after the attacks produced detailed assessments of physical damage, casualty patterns, and the medical consequences of radiation exposure. Some of these reports were classified for years. The portions dealing specifically with the delayed effects of radiation exposure on survivors were of particular interest to military planners concerned with the future use of nuclear weapons, and some of the information about long-term radiation effects was not made fully available to the Japanese medical community treating survivors for several years after the attacks. The Manhattan Project itself had generated internal reports throughout its development that addressed the question of what kind of weapon was being built and what would happen when it was used. The scientists involved knew. The reports they wrote describing the projected effects on human populations were filed. The Frank Report, produced in June 1945 by a committee of Manhattan Project scientists, including James Frank, recommended against a surprise atomic attack on a Japanese city and suggested instead a demonstration on an uninhabited area or advance warning. The report was submitted to the Secretary of War's Interim Committee. It was reviewed and rejected. The committee's assessment, documented in its own minutes, was that a demonstration might not be sufficiently convincing and that a direct attack on a city would be more likely to produce the desired effect on Japanese decision-making. The Frank Report was classified. It was not made public until 1963. The forced labor programs operated by Germany in occupied territories employed approximately 12 million foreign workers by 1944. The program was administered through a governmental office headed by Fritz Sauckel, who bore the formal title Plenipotentiary General for Labor Deployment. Sauckel was tried at Nuremberg and executed. The companies that used the labor, including Volkswagen, BMW, Krupp, Bayer, and dozens of others, operated within the legal framework the Nazi government had established for the use of forced labor. They submitted requisitions, received allocations, managed payroll accounts in which wages were often never paid or were seized at source, and filed reports on productivity and attrition. The corporate documentation of forced labor use was extensive. It was held in company archives. The post-war legal treatment of the corporations that had used forced labor was substantially different from the treatment of government officials who had administered the programs. Most corporate executives were not prosecuted. Some were tried in the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings and received sentences that were commuted substantially before the relevant occupation authority transferred judicial responsibility to the West German government. Compensation for surviving forced laborers was contested for decades. A settlement fund was established in 2000, 55 years after the war's end, funded jointly by German industry and the German government. The corporate records were not destroyed. They were retained in company archives. They were not voluntarily disclosed to historians for several decades. When they were disclosed, or when researchers gained access to them through pressure or legal process, the documentation of how the programs operated at the corporate level, the requisitions, the correspondence with the SS about prisoner transfers, the productivity reports, was detailed and clear. The Katyn massacre, in which approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, police officers, intellectuals, and other prisoners were executed by the Soviet NKVD in the spring of 1940, was known to the Allied governments in substantially accurate form well before the end of the war. The Germans discovered mass graves in 1943 and announced them publicly as evidence of Soviet atrocities. An international commission of forensic pathologists from occupied countries and neutral nations examined the site and concluded that the killings had occurred in 1940 when the Soviet Union controlled the area. The Soviets denied responsibility and attributed the killings to German forces. The American and British governments, both of which received intelligence assessments pointing to Soviet responsibility, chose not to press the issue during the war on the grounds that maintaining the alliance with the Soviet Union was strategically necessary. The official position was that the question of responsibility was uncertain and required further investigation. This position was maintained despite the existence of internal reports, including a report prepared by the American Embassy in London that concluded Soviet responsibility was likely, and another assessment from an American military observer sent to examine the site who reached the same conclusion and whose report was subsequently suppressed by the Office of War Information. A congressional investigation in 1951 and 1952 concluded that Soviet responsibility was established beyond reasonable doubt. The Soviet Union maintained its denial until 1990, when Mikhail Gorbachev acknowledged that the NKVD had carried out the killings. The relevant Soviet documents were released partially in 1992. The full scope of documentation from the Russian side remains partially restricted. The families of the victims spent decades being told by their own government's representatives that the question was uncertain. The government representatives who said this knew otherwise. The reports that would have established the facts publicly were classified. They were not destroyed, they were filed. The British internment of German Jews who had fled Nazi Germany and arrived in Britain as refugees, is a specific subset of the broader internment of enemy aliens that occurred in Britain in 1940. After the fall of France, the British government, responding to concerns about fifth column activity, interned approximately 27,000 people classified as enemy aliens, the majority of whom were German and Austrian Jews and anti-Nazi political refugees who had fled to Britain specifically to escape the regime whose supposed representatives they were now being interned for the potential benefit of. The internment was carried out under emergency regulations. The process was administrative. The tribunals that reviewed individual cases varied widely in thoroughness and fairness. Many individuals were interned for months before their cases were reviewed. Some internees were transported to Canada and Australia on ships that were not adequately protected against submarine attack. The Arandora Star, carrying German and Italian internees to Canada, was torpedoed by a German submarine in July 1940 and sank with the loss of approximately 800 lives, a substantial proportion of them Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi Germany. The irony of Jewish refugees being killed by a German weapon while being transported by a British ship to internment in Canada was noted in internal correspondence at the time. It was not a significant feature of public communication. The reports generated by the internment process, including the tribunal records and the administrative correspondence surrounding the Arandora Star sinking, were held in government archives. The episode was acknowledged in official histories, but did not generate the kind of sustained public reckoning that its specific character might suggest. The American military's use of Japanese-American soldiers in combat, specifically the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, while simultaneously interning their families, was documented in detail. The unit became one of the most decorated in American military history. The men who composed it were legally classified in the same category as the population being interned. The administrative apparatus that managed their deployment and the administrative apparatus that managed the internment of their families operated through different chains of command, but within the same governmental framework. The reports that documented the unit's performance and the reports that documented the conditions in the internment camps both existed, both were filed, and both were available to the same government. The treatment of black American soldiers in the segregated United States military produced its own category of reports. Black soldiers who had served in the European theater and returned to the American South were subject to violence in the period immediately following the war. The NAACP submitted detailed reports to the federal government documenting attacks on black veterans, including murders. President Truman received a briefing on a specific case, that of Sergeant Isaac Woodard, a black veteran who was beaten and blinded by a police officer in South Carolina within hours of receiving his honorable discharge while still in uniform. Truman expressed shock and ordered an investigation. The officer responsible was tried in federal court and acquitted by an all-white jury. The Attorney General's office had prepared the case and recommended prosecution. The jury acquittal was the outcome. The reports about violence against black veterans were filed. They documented a pattern. The pattern was not addressed in ways that resolved it. The military remained segregated until Truman's executive order in 1948. The violence continued in the interim. The Spanish Civil War, which preceded the Second World War and served as a testing ground for weapons and tactics that would be used more extensively in the larger conflict, produced a specific category of suppressed report related to the Condor Legion, the German air and armor unit that supported Franco's nationalist forces. The aerial bombing of Guernica in April 1937 was reported by journalists, documented by the Basque government, and internationally condemned. It was also analyzed internally by the German military as a tactical and operational learning experience. The reports generated by the Condor Legion on the effectiveness of various bombing approaches against civilian targets were incorporated into the Luftwaffe's operational planning for the early stages of the war in Poland and France. The connection between the Spanish testing ground and the subsequent campaigns was documented in German military records. It was known to Allied intelligence before the war began. The normalization of the bombing of civilian populations, the gradual acceptance across all major powers that air warfare necessarily involved the death of non-combatants in large numbers, was a process that can be traced through a series of internal reports and policy documents from the 1930s through the end of the war. Each step in the normalization was justified in relation to the previous step. The first bombing of a civilian population was a war crime. The second was a response to the first. By the third and fourth, the category had shifted. It was no longer described primarily as a crime. It was described as a strategy. The strategies were debated on their merits. The casualty figures were noted as operational outcomes. The operational language did not carry the moral weight that the same facts described in different language would have carried. The treatment of prisoners of war by Japanese forces is extensively documented and was prosecuted at the Tokyo War Crimes trials. What is less commonly discussed is the specific administrative process by which the treatment of prisoners was authorized and managed. The Japanese military operated under a code, Bushido as it was applied in the militarized context of the Imperial Armed Forces, that formally denigrated the act of surrender and defined those who surrendered as having forfeited their rights to the protections that combatants who continued to fight retained. This was not an informal attitude. It was formalized in military regulations and in the training of officers and non-commissioned officers. The treatment of prisoners was, in this sense, legally authorized by the internal legal framework of the Japanese military, even as that framework was in direct contradiction to the international legal framework Japan had formally accepted. The reports produced by the International Committee of the Red Cross about conditions in Japanese prisoner-of-war camps were substantially different from the reports about conditions in European prisoner-of-war camps. The ICRC's access to Japanese camps was limited and frequently denied. The reports it did produce were communicated through diplomatic channels and received by Allied governments without producing the kind of direct intervention that might have changed conditions for the roughly 140,000 Allied prisoners held by Japan. The decision-making about how to respond to the reports, weighing diplomatic and military calculations against the interests of the prisoners, was documented in internal communications that were filed and are available in archives. The American government's advanced knowledge of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor has been the subject of more conspiracy theory than almost any other aspect of the war. The documented reality is less dramatic than the conspiracist version, but more troubling in a different way. The available intelligence in the weeks and days before December 7, 1941, was genuine, substantial, and distributed across multiple agencies that did not share information effectively with each other or with the commands at Pearl Harbor. The Army and the Navy maintained separate intelligence operations. The State Department maintained another. The FBI maintained another. The cryptanalysis operation that had broken Japanese diplomatic codes, the Magic Intercepts, was distributed to a limited set of recipients on a need-to-know basis that did not include the commanders at Pearl Harbor. The investigations conducted after the attack produced reports that documented the intelligence failures with considerable precision. The congressional investigation, the Roberts Commission report, the Army Pearl Harbor Board, the Navy Court of Inquiry, these produced findings that were classified in full or in part for years. The Army Pearl Harbor Board concluded in 1944 that Army Chief of Staff George Marshall bore a degree of responsibility for the intelligence failure. That conclusion was classified. It was not made part of the public record at the time. Marshall's reputation was not affected by it in any significant way during his lifetime. The post-attack investigations found what they found. The findings were filed. Some were released, some were not. The narrative of Pearl Harbor as a surprise attack that was the product of Japanese treachery rather than American institutional failure was the narrative that served the mobilization of the country. The more complicated findings were handled accordingly. The role of IBM in facilitating the logistics of the Nazi persecution of Jews and other targeted populations has been documented most extensively by Edwin Black in his 2001 book on the subject. The core of the documentation is the use of IBM punch card machines and the associated Hollerith data processing system to manage the census data, labor allocation records, transportation logistics, and concentration camp prisoner tracking that the Nazi state's population management required at scale. IBM maintained business relationships with its German subsidiary throughout the 1930s and into the war itself. The machines were leased, not sold, which meant IBM's ongoing involvement in their maintenance was built into the operational model. The documentation of this relationship exists in corporate records, in German government archives, and in the records of the post-war proceedings. IBM did not voluntarily disclose the details of this relationship. The company has acknowledged the historical record in general terms, while contesting some of the most specific claims about executive knowledge and involvement. The technical reality that IBM machines were used in the management of the populations the Nazi state was persecuting and killing is not seriously disputed by historians. The question of what American corporate leadership knew and when is a different question, and the documentary record on that question is less complete than one would wish. Some of the relevant corporate records have not been made available to independent researchers. The post-war reconstruction of German industry and government, specifically the continuity of personnel between the Nazi state and the Federal Republic of Germany, was not hidden exactly, but it was managed. The Gehlen organization, which became the basis for the West German intelligence service, was built around Reinhard Gehlen, who had been the chief of German military intelligence on the Eastern Front. Gehlen negotiated with American intelligence before the war ended, offering his network and his files in exchange for personal protection and operational continuity. The agreement was made. The CIA funded and operated the Gehlen organization from 1946 until the creation of the West German Federal Intelligence Service in 1956, at which point the organization was formally transferred to West German governmental control with Gehlen still at its head. The personnel of the Gehlen organization included former members of the SS, the SD, and the Gestapo. Some had been involved in war crimes. The American intelligence services that sponsored the organization knew this, or knew enough to know that they did not have a complete picture of what they were sponsoring. The reports that CIA officers wrote about the organization's personnel included assessments of what was known and what was unknown about the pasts of specific individuals. These reports were classified. Some have since been released through the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, which required the declassification of American government records related to Nazi war criminals beginning in 1998. The continuity of personnel was not limited to intelligence. The West German judiciary, medical profession, academic institutions, and diplomatic corps retained substantial numbers of individuals who had served the Nazi state in capacities that ranged from administrative to directly criminal. This was documented at the time by journalists, by the East German government, which had strategic reasons for publicizing the Western failure to denazify effectively, and by individual researchers. The Simon Wiesenthal Center and similar organizations have maintained records of specific cases. The German government's own investigations, including the work of the Ludwigsburg Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes, produced documentation of cases that were not prosecuted because statutes of limitations had run out, because witnesses were unavailable, because evidence had been destroyed, or because prosecutors made decisions not to proceed. The action. Reinhard death camps. The 3 camps built specifically for the implementation of the final solution in occupied Poland, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, operated for roughly 2 years and killed approximately 1.7 million people. Unlike the concentration camps, these were not labor facilities. Their sole function was killing. The administrative structure that supported them was part of the SS bureaucracy. The SS officers who ran them filed operational reports. The reports noted the numbers processed. The language used was operational language. It referred to the process of killing in terms that were several steps removed from the physical reality of what was happening. The trains that brought people to the camps were managed by the Deutsche Reichsbahn, the German National Railway, whose scheduling department coordinated the movement of deportation trains with its other logistical responsibilities. Railway employees submitted timesheets. Officials signed off on billing records for the transport of Jewish deportees. The billing category was group transport. The camps themselves were dismantled at the end of their operational period. The sites were plowed under and planted. Trees were planted. Former SS personnel were given false identities and reassigned. The physical erasure was substantial. The documentary erasure was less complete. The railway records survived. The SS administrative records survived in significant portions. The testimony of survivors, a small number relative to the number killed, provided accounts of the operational procedures. The report that did not exist, or that has not been found, is a document explicitly authorizing the final solution signed by Hitler. The directive was communicated and understood without such a document. The bureaucratic apparatus that implemented it operated with sufficient coordination to function at scale without a single founding document that tied everything to a single signature. The Wannsee Conference of January 1942, in which senior SS and government officials coordinated the administrative arrangements for the extermination program, produced a protocol that served as coordination documentation. The protocol was written in bureaucratic language that required familiarity with the relevant terminology to understand fully. It was not the founding document. It was a coordination document. The program was already underway when the conference was held. The conference protocol survived because a copy was found at the end of the war in the files of the German Foreign Office. Other copies were presumably destroyed. The relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and the concentration camp system extended beyond the specific case of Bayer and its predecessor company, IG Farben. Medical experiments conducted in camps were often sponsored by pharmaceutical companies seeking data on drug effectiveness in conditions that civilian medical ethics would not permit. The companies were aware of where the data was coming from. The contracts were signed. The data was delivered. The products developed using the data went to market. Some of those products were in use for years after the war. The companies involved were not, for the most part, prosecuted for these specific activities, though some executives were tried in the broader IG Farben case at Nuremberg and received sentences that were substantially reduced before the relevant occupation authority transferred jurisdiction. The documentation of the commercial relationships between the pharmaceutical industry and the camp system exists in the records of the Nuremberg proceedings and in corporate archives that have been accessed by historians at varying levels of completeness over the decades since the war. The bombing of Monte Cassino in February 1944, the destruction of the ancient Benedictine monastery that sat on a hill overlooking the German defensive line in Italy, was the result of a decision made by Allied command on the basis of intelligence assessments that concluded German forces were using the monastery as an observation post. After the war, German commanders and veterans consistently maintained that German forces had scrupulously avoided occupying the monastery itself, and that it had not been used as a military installation at the time of the bombing. American intelligence assessments prepared after the fact were more ambiguous. The monastery was destroyed. The bombing did not immediately break the German defensive line. The ground attack that followed the bombing was repulsed. The Germans, after the bombing, did occupy the ruins as a defensive position. The reports that preceded the bombing decision were filed. The intelligence assessments were classified. The post-war controversy about whether the intelligence was accurate or whether the bombing was justified by what was actually known at the time has continued in military history circles. The destruction of a major cultural and religious site was an embarrassment regardless of the tactical justification, and the handling of public communication about the decision reflects the institutional preference for certain framings that operated throughout the war. The forced repatriation of Soviet citizens, including Cossacks and other Soviet nationals who had served with or alongside German forces under Operation Keelhaul, carried out by British and American forces in 1945 and 1946, transferred approximately 2 million people to Soviet custody against their will. A significant number of those transferred were executed or died in the Gulag. The operation was carried out under the terms of the Yalta Agreement, which included provisions for the repatriation of Soviet nationals found in Allied-occupied territory. British and American forces carried out the agreement with varying degrees of force, in some cases deporting individuals who were not Soviet nationals and who were not covered by the agreement's terms. The reports generated by the military units that carried out the repatriations described scenes that some officers found disturbing. Some officers refused orders. Some requested transfers. The overall operation continued. The reports were filed. They were classified. The operation was not publicly acknowledged in detail for several decades. The individuals who were handed over to Soviet custody and subsequently died are not counted in Allied casualty figures. The Tokyo War Crimes Trials, formerly the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, prosecuted 28 senior Japanese military and government leaders. 7 were executed, 16 were sentenced to life imprisonment. The tribunal excluded several categories of individuals from prosecution. Emperor Hirohito was not tried. The decision not to try the emperor was made primarily by General MacArthur on the grounds that prosecuting the emperor would destabilize Japanese society and complicate the occupation. The emperor's role in war-making decisions was documented in the records of the Imperial General Headquarters, which were partly destroyed at the end of the war and partly preserved. The historical debate about the degree of Hirohito's personal involvement in the decisions that led to the war and sustained it has continued for decades. The exclusion of the emperor from prosecution required the suppression of testimony and documentation that might have implicated him. Some of the defendants who were tried adjusted their testimony to avoid implicating the emperor in ways that might have forced the Allied powers to reconsider the immunity decision. This adjustment was not incidental to the proceedings. It shaped what the tribunal recorded as the facts. The records of the tribunal exist. They are extensive. They document both what was found and what the structure of the proceedings was designed not to find. The use of German scientists and engineers under Operation Paperclip brought approximately 1,600 German specialists in rocketry, aeronautics, chemistry, and related fields to the United States in the years immediately following the war. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, which administered the program, operated under a directive that required it to evaluate candidates for Nazi Party membership and war crimes involvement before authorization. The directive was followed selectively. Some candidates whose records showed SS membership or involvement in the use of forced labor were cleared anyway on the grounds of their technical value. In some cases, records were altered to remove or minimize incriminating details. The Joint Chiefs of Staff approved the program with knowledge that the screening process was not producing clean results. The program was not publicly announced. When journalists began to inquire about the presence of German scientists in American facilities, the standard response was that individuals were being brought over on temporary contracts for specific technical purposes and that their records had been evaluated. The evaluation process was described in terms that suggested more thoroughness than it had in practice involved. Werner von Braun, who had been the technical director of the V-2 rocket program and had held the rank of SS Sturmbannführer, a major, became the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket that put American astronauts on the moon. His SS membership and his knowledge of the conditions in the Mittelwerk underground factory where V-2 rockets were produced using concentration camp labor, conditions that killed thousands of workers, were known to the American officials who sponsored his entry into the country. His paperclip file noted his party and SS membership, and the circumstances were assessed as not disqualifying given his technical value. The reports about Mittelwerk, which documented the mortality rates among the forced laborers used in V-2 production, were available in captured German records. They documented a facility where the death rate among workers was higher than the rate of production-related accidents could account for. The conditions were intentional in the sense that the managers of the facility, including SS overseers, had the authority to improve conditions and did not exercise it. Von Braun died in 1977. He was awarded the National Medal of Science by President Ford in 1975. The records of the war's end contain within them the records of systems that were not ended. The intelligence networks were maintained. The scientific expertise was transferred. The corporate relationships were restructured. The legal frameworks developed to govern the treatment of prisoners, civilians, and occupied populations were incorporated into international law through the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and other instruments. But the practical enforcement mechanisms for those frameworks remained the prerogative of states that had demonstrated a consistent willingness to define the frameworks in terms of their own operational convenience. The administrative apparatus that processed people through the concentration camp system was not unique to National Socialism. It was an expression of what administrative systems can become when their internal logic is allowed to operate without friction. The friction that prevents administrative systems from reaching those outcomes is not inherent to the systems themselves, it is external to them. It is produced by institutions, legal frameworks, political cultures, and individual decisions that impose constraints on what systems are permitted to do. When those constraints are removed or suspended, the systems continue to function. They continue to produce outputs. The outputs are whatever the inputs and the logic of the system generate. The war ended with a set of documents, surrender instruments, occupation agreements, the charters of new international institutions, the transcripts of war crimes proceedings, the reports of investigating commissions, the classified intelligence assessments, the operational after-action reports, the corporate quarterly filings, the personnel records of the organizations that continued operating after the formal cessation of hostilities with new names and new institutional affiliations. The filing did not stop when the war stopped. It continued. The same processes of documentation, classification, selective disclosure, and institutional management of information that had operated during the war continued to operate afterward. The archives that held the records of what had been done grew. Some of the records were eventually released. Some have not been. Some were destroyed by individuals who understood what they contained and made a decision accordingly. Some were destroyed by administrative processes that treated old records as routine disposal candidates without specific reference to their content. The most recent German government initiative related to the repatriation of Nazi-looted cultural property. A systematic program of review and return is conducted by committees that file reports, issue findings, and make recommendations. The process is ongoing. The claims are processed. The recommendations are made. Some restitutions occur. Some do not. The committees file their reports. The reports are archived. The last survivors of the major concentration camps have died or are in the final years of their lives. The institutions that preserved their testimony continue to operate. The documentation they have produced is extensive. It is indexed and searchable. It is available to researchers. It sits alongside the administrative records of the systems that produced the experiences the testimony describes. The administrative records and the testimony occupy the same archive space. They are organized according to different classification systems. They describe the same events from positions that do not speak to each other. The Nuremberg trials created a legal category, crimes against humanity, that had not existed as a formal legal concept before 1945. The category was necessary because the existing law of war, which governed the treatment of combatants and to some degree civilians, did not adequately describe what had been done. The creation of the category was significant. It was incorporated into international law. It was invoked in subsequent proceedings in the decades that followed. The tribunals that invoked it were constituted by states that retained the practical authority to define when the category applied and when it did not. The category existed within a legal system whose enforcement depended on the willingness of states to enforce it. The willingness of states to enforce it has been, throughout the period since 1945, determined by the same kinds of strategic, political, and institutional calculations that shaped the handling of information during the war itself. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg concluded its proceedings in October 1946. The judgment established that following orders was not a sufficient defense against a charge of crimes against humanity. The judgment was delivered. It was incorporated into international legal doctrine. The officials who had administered the systems through which the crimes were committed, at levels below those prosecuted at Nuremberg, returned to civilian life in numbers that dwarfed the number prosecuted. The files that documented their activities were filed. Some were destroyed. Some were preserved. Some are still being found.